Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Futures Frame TV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host on the Inequalities channel. I have the great pleasure today of introducing you to Javier Gonzalez, if you don't know him yet, world-famous economist and the director of SUMA, which is the Laboratory for Education, Research and Innovation for Latin America and the Caribbean, based in Chile, working on a regional level. And he's also an affiliated lecturer at the University of Cambridge and researching at the COES, which is the Center for Inequality Research at the University of Chile. Welcome, Javier, to our program.
Thank you, Alice. Great to be here talking to you.
Great to have you here today, where we want to talk about the context of inequality in Chile. We want to contextualize inequality in Chile to understand a little bit about what social situation there currently is, where it comes from, and what your field of expertise, which is educational inequality, how that relates to the Chilean context. So to start off, could you explain what inequality looks like in Chile? How do we have to imagine that?
Thank you, Alice. Well, first of all, we have to maybe contextualize the fact that Chile is in Latin America, as you know, is the most unequal region in the world. And Chile is quite an unequal country as well. Inequalities are basically based in very unjust institutions, politically, in the economic sphere, but also in the social sphere. And what is important to understand is that there are very long-standing inequalities. Actually, there are quite interesting figures in the case of Chile. Not every country has long-standing figures. We have a study that measures the Gini coefficient, for example, for the last 150 years, and it shows how it has been oscillating around 0.5 to 0.6 Gini points in the last 150 years. And that basically what it shows you is that inequality is a structural issue.
And it's also extremely high. Sorry, right? So to explain that a Gini of 5 or 6 is very high.
It's extremely high by any comparative measure whatsoever. And that basically proves the fact that it's an inequality that is structural to our society. Of course, it's a long-standing problem from colonial times, but then into the republic, into the independent republic. An important thing is that it's not only structural, but it has been a structured inequality. And here the elites play a key role. And as you know, a Chilean economist, Palma, has shown how the destiny of the top income are intertwined with the destiny of the bottom income classes, the lower classes. So sometimes we have a discourse, some groups in society have the discourse that, well, let's focus on poverty, let's leave rich people alone to create employment. Of course, I don't agree with that view. And that's why I'm also mentioning Palma's work, where he shows actually that where rich have more and are able to concentrate more income, that has a direct impact also on poverty. In the case of Chile, well, the 1%, the top 1% income has more than 20% of GDP. And depending if we look at it before or after tax, it can go even 30% when we take capital gains. So it's an extremely unequal society, a long-standing unequal society, which has been exacerbated also by policies, especially by policies coming from the 80s, very neoliberal policies promoted by the Pinochet era, which they were in a way modified during democracy after the 90s, but did not change the paradigm, a paradigm which basically is based on institutions that are very unequal, that are very focused on the poorest. And therefore, we have social policies which are quite fragmented and basically focused and very weak and very focused towards the poorest. And I think that has created a quite legitimate demand for most of the middle class and the lower and the middle class of the Chilean society to demand a change of logic or change of paradigm, moving from this logic of focalization of resources into the poor into universal services of social rights, basically. And that has created this very strong pressure into the political system to basically change the key institutions. Now, what are those key institutions actually that we should change? Of course, there are many, and as we know, they are the result of power struggles in which most of the time the elite has been able to impose to their benefit the type of institution, the rules of the game that really benefit them. And one of those areas where it's very clear, and of course we can mention from property rights in extractive industries, etc. But one which is very clear, of course, is on taxation. Chile has a very low tax revenue, just above 20% of GDP. Been long-standing, more or less, tax revenues around 21% of GDP, and that is quite low both today if we compare, for example, with the OECD countries. But recently, I just published Oxford Handbook, a study showing what happened, for example, with tax revenues when countries of the OECD had the same GDP per capita. So basically, what I was trying to prove there and argue is that actually it's not an issue that has to do with, let's say, Chileans' stage of development. It has to do with a political choice. So what we can see actually is the fact that even when countries in the OECD had the same GDP per capita in Chile today, they used to have much higher taxes than what we have today. And that has, of course, a direct effect on the capacity of the state to redistribute income and to reduce inequality. So in that sense, of course, we follow, and I'm thinking of Andy Esping Anderson's framework in terms of social democratic welfare states and more conservative welfare states. We're even more liberal than the usual liberal states, and we tend to have a very low impact on the redistribution. If we look at pre-tax versus post-tax and post-transfer, the effect of the state is very low, usually just a couple of reduction in terms of Gini points. One thing is that we tax very little, but also is that it's quite regressive in the fact that most of the taxes come from VAT, so basically value added tax, which is paid by the whole of the population and most proportionally paid by the poor. Whereas the income tax are lower, the brackets and the maximum tax rates for higher incomes are quite low, even comparatively. We cannot forget, and Piketty has done a great job in bringing again to the table and to a larger public the fact that both the UK and the US had maximum tax rates over 80% during the golden age of capitalism in the 40s, 60s. And therefore, in Chile, we can see that it's very regressive tax system. So the fact is, we have a high level of inequality. It has been decreasing in the last years, but still we're quite high, with a state which does not have the capacity to collect enough taxes, basically because of the pressure of the elite to reduce to that capacity. And therefore, then we have very focalized, very fragmented social policies instead of universal social policy. And that creates several issues. Among those are, of course, education, which is another key institution to promote social mobility, to promote equality of opportunity.
Before we go into the issue of education, would you say then, with this explanation of elite pressure and of the choices that are made in terms of institution, that this persistent inequality, the historically persistent inequality, structured and structural, as you say, it's a political choice?
Definitely. Basically, it's a political struggle, I would put it. But it's at the end of the game, it's a social choice that basically we're not able to really face and really change the institutions for the benefit of the majority of Chileans. And therefore, at some point, the elites try to convince the fact that what is called the chorreo, so basically is that what
trickle down.
The trickle down theory, which basically at some point people will benefit. And of course, it's true. Chile has a huge reduction in terms of poverty rates. But if you look at the distribution of income, actually, most of the 80%, the bottom 80%, looks quite similar with very low wages. And then there's a spike basically in the last 20, and especially in the last 10 or 5%, really. So this idea of trickling down has not really happened in terms of income distribution. And therefore, it has been argued that let's say in the 80s and 90s, that this what has to do with the stage of development. And that's why I was putting the fact that we can see that countries, just to put another example, not now in taxation, but in terms of the delivery of social services, we can think of, for example, the UK regarding the NHS, the National Health System, which is a quite extended national service in health. It was basically promoted in 1944 onwards, when the UK was quite poorer than Chile it is today. And still in Chile, we have a system which is basically highly privatized and that does not really cover all the health issues. So it is a political issue. It's not an economic issue. Being an economist, I would say both the levels of taxation that we have, but also the type of social services that we provide to the population.
Do you think that with the social pressure now and with the conflict over the last year and a bit, things will be changing? Will there be a structural change, institutional change? I mean, you have an institutional change now with the voting for the new constitution, which is unprecedented, and congratulations, is going to be an important step, I guess. But what is your take on this?
So indeed, I think we're in a historical moment in Chile. We have had several social movements. They started actually from education. So one of the most important ones was in 2006, then in 2011 with so first it was the secondary students, then it moved into higher education. And now finally in 2019, we had a huge social movement demanding dignity. And I think that's quite interesting because, as you know, the fundamental principle behind human rights has to do with human dignity. Humans unending themselves, not I mean for other issues, and that has to do with that dignity. And it's quite remarkable that the whole social movement took this as their main slogan: we want dignity. And from that, basically, it ended up in the possibility of having this election to decide if we could choose a new and write a new constitution. And finally, just a week ago, 78%, quite high level, so it was astonishing amount of percentage in favor of changing the Chilean constitution. So it's really the first time that Chile will have the chance of writing the constitution by an assembly elected by the people, for the people.
Puts me the little hairs stand up, like goosebumps.
So it is really an historical moment. And that gives a chance to rethink the whole institutional structure in terms of, for example, and most importantly, in terms of the social rights, which is something which I think Chile is really lagging behind.
And one of those social rights is, of course, I mean, you mentioned health, but the other paradigmatic one is, of course, education. Do you have hope that the educational system will improve to be more inclusive, to be more qualitatively high-walking?
From SUMA, we have just released a new research looking at more than 25 constitutions around the world. And what we're trying to see here, as I was saying, is what are the main critical issues that should be changed in the Constitution? And also, what are those issues that should be changed to meet the international standards by human rights, in terms of the human rights? But also looking at what have other societies managed to do in their constitutions. This is not a utopian exercise, but it's actually a quite realistic one. So basically, what we're trying to show is that other societies have achieved this movement towards reflecting in their constitutions democratic principles such as equality, liberty, fraternity, inclusion. And among the three issues, because we reached at least 10, actually there are 10 critical issues that should be changed, but they are clustered around three things. So the first thing has to do with how we understand the right to education. And today in the Constitution of Chile, the right to education is not enforceable. That means basically that if I would tell you that you have a right for anything, and if that thing is not provided to you, you of course should be able to go to a court and say, I want to enforce that. Today, the Chilean right to education is not enforceable in a court. And whereas other rights, they are actually enforceable. And they're detailed in the Article 20 of the Constitution in Chile, which says, for example, property rights are enforceable, the freedom of education, actually, to teach, it's enforceable, but the right to education is not. So it's one thing is to make it enforceable. The second thing is how we understand the concept of the right to education. We're not trying to reinvent it, but actually to take it again from the international standards. Basically, the right to education has at least four dimensions, and it's defined in terms of four dimensions. And in the Constitution right now, we're only guaranteeing one, which it has to do with the provision of free education at the primary and secondary level. But we're not actually providing three other dimensions which are key. One has to do with the non-discrimination principle. So basically that people can access education without any discrimination. Just to put an example, today in schools, two-thirds of children, LGBTI children, are bullied. And basically, when we ask them, who are you being bullied by? Most of them are bullied by teachers and adults, not by students. So that's, for example of how discrimination actually looks like in Chilean schools. There's a third issue that has to do with adaptability, which, for example, countries such as Switzerland, they put a lot of attention in the sense of guaranteeing that each region should adapt the language and the curriculum to the type of students they are teaching, basically they're educating in terms of, for example, minority groups. So adaptability in the case of Chile actually is not really guaranteed. And it's very important in a country where we're having a lot of conflicts, actually, because ethnic minority groups are not really well recognized in the Chilean constitution. And the fourth has to do with quality. There are several countries in which, in their own constitutions, they establish, for example, such as the Netherlands, in which they establish, for example, a certain requirements in terms of that teachers should comply with certain level or some kind of standards. So the right to education has to be enforceable. It has to be better understood. Also, take into account, for example, in countries such as Germany or in Finland or in other countries, in which they establish explicitly the fact that those students that need more should get more in terms of resources, in terms of support. And that's at the constitutional level. In Chile, and I was part of quite important financial reform, which is called La Subvención Escolar Preferencial. So it's the voucher, basically, where pupil funding was changed now according to the social economic background. But that was quite a struggle politically to get that through. And that should have been provided by the constitution already. So that's one thing. The second thing has to do with the role of the state. The role of the state in Chile in the constitution is understood in a very weak manner, in which basically the state can only act if there is a failure in the market. So it doesn't have the capacity to enforce really and guarantee the quality of education. It doesn't have the capacity to regulate the sector. Chile is one of the most privatized systems in the world, which basically has a huge impact in segregation and inequality. And in that sense, just as many other countries do, and we don't, the Constitution does not allow the state to have a priority policy towards public education. Okay? So it has to treat private and public sector the same. And therefore, it does not recognize the value of a pluralistic and diverse public sector. And the last but not least has to do with how do we understand the freedom of parents, which is part of the human right, of course, for parents to provide education that is, of course, adapted to their beliefs, etc. And in that sense, in Chile, that is taken as in a very laissez-faire manner, understood in terms of that anyone can open a school. They usually has several rules to exclude, not to include. And we can see, for example, let me go back to Germany or Belgium, in which I'm going to put the specific case of Germany, in the case that they provide they establish in the constitution the fact that private schools in primary education can only be opened if there's a justified case in terms of the innovation, the pedagogical innovation that new school is offering. So it's not taken for granted. It's actually something that is very regulated, and it has to have a specific value. And beyond that, also, it is the fact that also both, for example, Germany and Belgium, they established the fact that although education is not, of course, state education is not religious education, it has to provide the possibility as an optional of education in terms of the religion of the people that they're serving. And that allows basically to include plurality and diversity within the public system without making it religious, of course, but including them instead of excluding them. In Chile, we understand this freedom in terms of, basically as an exodus from the public sector to the private. And that allows basically the elite to opt out of the public sector, which then has an impact on the funding system and, of course, on taxation as well, because basically they're saying, why should I be paying taxes if I'm not using public health or public education, etc.? So these are the main issues at the very structural level that we should change. But of course, we have many other challenges in terms of education policies itself.
How did you, on a more personal note, as an inequalities researcher and an expert on these topics and thinking about them every day, how did you experience these social movements and the period? I know it's been when you just moved back to Chile after some years in the UK, in Cambridge. How was that to be involved in these or to be next to them, these social movements?
I mean, it's a very interesting moment. It brings a lot of hope, really. As you know, my research has to do with inequality. And the fact basically has to do with, since you're asking me, a more personal note, it's during my childhood and as a teenager, because of my parents' job, I lived in many countries, more than 8 countries, just in the period of my early youth, and countries from the Middle East to the United States, in Europe, in Latin America. And it was always a quite important question for me is why the societies look so different. Something I came to understand later on had to do with these institutions, both the formal, but of course, the social norms and the informal institutions that rule our lives and the way we live in society. So these social movements, I think, are quite important because what they're doing is for the first time in a very long time in Chile, they're really questioning the very foundations of how we understand a society should look like. So it's an opportunity to open our minds and look at other societies as well, learn from them, from their mistakes, but also from things that are important in terms of how we shape these institutions to reflect and better reflect, as I was saying earlier, these philosophical principles that should guide our social life. So it is opening actually this opportunity of changing the framework, the constitution, to basically imagine different futures, really. And in that sense, it opens then, of course, an important way for new public policies, because, of course, changing the constitutions is just the beginning. It's a quite necessary step, but it will not be sufficient. But it will open possibilities in terms of other types of social policies based on a human rights perspective. And that's really, really challenging and it brings a lot of hope.
It's very exciting and it's very well fitting with our own channel, The Futures Framed. And you say that you're at a moment where you're imagining new futures. And I like that as a moment to come to a closure. But is there anything you'd like to add that we definitely need to know that we can learn maybe from this particular moment of Chilean history?
I think maybe what I was just mentioning is the power of changing our paradigms, really. I think for us as researchers, if we look at the 80s and 90s, that everything was about poverty, and therefore the solutions had to do with cash transfers and focalization of policies. And I think as Latin Americans, we left out the component of social cohesion, which is key to really understand how our political and social life. And I think what's interesting is to start changing that paradigm, to really focus on inequality and how we treat each other and how we're able not only to criticize, but also to build a new society. So in that sense, first, there's some lessons in terms of the importance of making that change, of starting to look the importance of inequality or of equality, and the importance of social cohesion. Without social cohesion, societies erode themselves and are basically destroyed as a community. So I think this highlights the importance, the glue that sticks us together and that makes our institutions legitimate are torn apart if we leave inequality to really corrode our societies. Sometimes we're quite blind to that. And I think what the Chilean case is showing actually is that these things matter, and that at some point they will be expressed violently, But on the other hand, and I think we're quite proud as a Chilean society, is that in the case of Chile, there was a capacity to channel this social energy institutionally, democratically. So instead of basically allowing this to grow into a civil war or in a really social conflict with no simple solution, well, there is no simple solution, but but the thing is, the society was able to channel the political system, which is actually right now quite damaged because it has not really been responsive to people's needs and people's demand. Despite that fact, we have to recognize the fact that they were able to channel, at least at some point, this social pressure into a change of constitution. So this brings hope into a change of an institutional change, which will be done peacefully for the majority of what is on stake. Of course, there has been a lot of violence in the street, but really I would judge it as a really minor compared to what this means in terms of the possibilities that are open for the future.
Thank you very much, Javier, for giving us this outlook on potentially positive and productive way of changing the situation from highly and extremely unequal towards something that in the future, as we imagine it, will be more inclusive and more egalitarian and more free as well for everybody participating. Well, this was another episode of Futures Frame TV. I'm Alice Krozer, your host on the Inequalities channel, and we hope you'll accompany us again next Saturday for another episode where we speak about inequality and anything related to it. Thank you for watching and have a good afternoon. See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Alice.